Thank you. I apologize also for having to speak in English. My Japanese is not that good, and I'm not going to try. There's still bridges to be crossed, though I must say before I start, doing Skype work across multiple different cultures has, I'm sure, made major neural changes in how I see myself and the world. There's nothing like that kind of immediacy of direct contact with others, and you become much more attuned to their experiences and their feelings and their pain. So I'm very grateful for the previous talk. Thanks to our hosts for putting on this unique conference. Let me say before I start just a couple of words about the direction I'm going to go in this talk. First, there's going to be a little bit of history, and then a little complexity theory, then into some ecology, and then into some new developments. In part, it's because of the difficulty of the subject, kokoro and symbiosis. They're so broad, they're so large, that I didn't try to use either term specifically, but found myself trying to find my pathway into the subject matter. I start with some history and of the Western psychoanalyst C.G. Jung, not only because I was trained in that, but I think the term kokoro probably has some of its closest resonances with his ideas of the psyche. And of course, I know Toshio's father was very influential in bringing that kind of psychology, Jungian psychology, to Japan and to Kyoto University. And so this is one of the links into that. And secondly, I think that the ideas about synchronicity need a kind of contemporizing developmental exploration, and that will take us through ecology and into symbiosis, I believe. So first, a little bit of background about the concept of synchronicity. Some of you are familiar, some are not. Jung framed this as a clinical concept originally. He later made it a cosmological concept. But as a clinical concept, the paradigm is the case he presented of a young woman who was in analysis with him, and the analysis became stuck because she was, as he said, overly rational. And in the obstacle, in the frustration that they were experiencing, she reported a dream to him in which she was given a piece of jewelry that included a golden scarab. And just as she was describing this in the dream, there was a tap, tap, tap on the window behind Jung, and he drew his attention, opened the window by the Lake of Zurich, and in flew a particular kind of beetle. And he caught it and presented it to the woman and said, "Here's your beetle." And this created a shock and a surprise that he felt opened up the therapy and made a major difference in her ability to experience otherness in a way that's partly an internal sense of otherness. And so he described this as a kind of synchronistic experience where there was something happening in the internal world that was met by something in the external world that had no simple causal relationship, but was very meaningful. So that a causal, meaningful connection became the idea of synchronicity. That's the kind of story in a nutshell. However, what you don't get there was Jung's own history and why he told this story. And I think that's extremely important, that because I'm an analyst and a psychologist, over the last 100 years, we have learned that our reactions, our empathy, is very much a part of the process. It cannot be kept outside. And so I was very interested to a period of time in Jung's life where he went through a crisis. That is, in the immediate aftermath of his break in relationships with Sigmund Freud. He had a personal crisis in which he had a series of visions on a train, seeing Europe filling up with blood. And he became rather disturbed by this, felt that he was in danger of a psychotic process. It certainly was traumatic for him. But unlike other people of the day, and he was a psychiatrist, so he was well versed in psychiatric illness, but unlike most other people in his field at the time, he decided to explore internally, to open up to what was happening in his internal world rather than trying to simply suppress this. And when he did that, he began to develop a technique called active imagination, which is in a way the use of one's reveries. And at first he was rather overwhelmed. He did some artwork associated with his experiences. This is now the famous Red Book. In this first image from early on, you see a blonde hero, a Germanic hero, fleeing a black beetle, and the image of a son being attacked by a bunch of snakes. I.e., this is a story of consciousness in great clinical duress. If a patient of mine did that, I would, in fact, imagine they were in a lot of deep psychological difficulty. However, Jung was not unaware of the deeper trans-historical, transcultural dimensions to this. And in fact, if you start to include a journey into ancient Egypt, you have this story of the night sea journey of the sun, that every night it goes into the underworld, and then in the morning it comes back out. It is carried on the bark, the boat of the gods, and each hour a different god is in charge. The first hour is the hour of the Beetle God Khepri. That's what we're seeing here. Another picture of it. There's the beetle-headed god Khepri during the first hour of the trip through the underworld. So the fact that Jung had already studied and known this well before not only his active imagination experience, but well before his encounter with the woman, tells me that his reactions were not simply a one-sided helping the patient, but they had much to do with his internal world and what was happening between the two of them. Now, fortunately for us, Jung was the kind of individual who, when faced with a challenge like this, threw himself into it and began to explore in great depth his own psychological experiences and began to metabolize them, to begin to work them through clinically, so that over time, and we'll see this in this next slide, in his Red Book, that first image I showed you was at the very beginning. This is now on page 55. It's much later, it's several years later. You see a similar kind of image, but instead of the hero, who, by the way, is an image of a kind of scientific rationalism of the day. Now, instead of being in the water with the threatening creature, there is a vehicle for consciousness, and there's a moving in concert together with the danger. That is, the relationship between the conscious and unconscious aspects of the mind have become more harmonious. One could say there's an empathic understanding intrapsychically, internal in the person. However, Jung was still wrestling at this point with what had happened to him. after the break, because at first he thought, am I going crazy? Am I becoming a madman? And then about 9 months later, World War I began, and the question was, oh my goodness, were these images prophetic? That was also not a very happy answer. And that formed a dilemma for him. Madness, prophecy. Were either one of those viable? Well, he didn't think so, but how to get out of this? The exit came 15 years later. It took him 15 years to get to the point where he began to have experiences that helped him move beyond this. And that came accidentally, what we'll call synchronistically, when he received from a friend of his in China a book called The Secret of the Golden Flower. This was Richard Wilhelm, who was a sinologist living in Tsingtao at the time. And Wilhelm had done a translation of this ancient Chinese alchemical manuscript. And when Jung received it, he was stunned because he felt that it had a picture in the front of it that was very much like a drawing he himself was just in the middle of doing. So in the Golden Flower, there's the Vajra Mandala, this image here. And Jung was in the midst of doing this mandala himself, which he curiously claimed the coloration for him had a Chinese feeling. I'm not sure I agree with that, but that was his projection. And this experience was singular. It changed his view of things. Within a couple of months of receiving this, in some classes, some private classes he was teaching, there was a set of dreams that happened where the material of the dreamer intersected with what was happening in the class in a way that no one would have predicted, that there was no communication between them. However, the students asked, well, what do you think is going on with all of these coincidences of material? And Jung responded, the East bases much of its science on this irregularity and considers coincidence as a reliable basis of the world rather than causality. Synchronism is a prejudice of the East, causality is the modern prejudice of the West. The more we busy ourselves with dreams, the more we shall see such coincidences, chances. Remember that the oldest Chinese scientific book, the I Ching, is about the possible chances of life. So what's happening, what we begin to see is that he is using synchronicity as a way to leave the dilemma of prophecy or madness by suggesting there may be something about the structure of reality that's quite different. That is, that there may be a link between internal and external states that has not yet been identified. What we could say is there's a subjective level to the objective world and an objective level to our subjective experience. And once you have that, the notion of synchronicity, then the dilemma of prophecy and madness begins to dissolve, because this is somehow the way one goes deeply inside of oneself. Think of meditation, to discover a truth about the world. And then he says, I've invented the word synchronicity as a term to cover these phenomena. That is, things happening at the same moment as an expression of the same time content. He later develops this into a whole cosmological idea, but I'm not going to take the time for that right now. Instead, what I'd like to do is begin to look at how we might reconsider this in terms of contemporary knowledge. When I first started to work on this, I had a series of highly traumatized patients, people with terrible sexual abuse in childhood for clients. And these kinds of experiences were remarkably frequent in that population. And I was wondering why. What is it about highly traumatized people that have this kind of mechanism of communication that is outside of the realm of the normal? And so I read Jung very carefully on the notions of synchronicity, and I realized that he didn't understand much physics, and his ideas were rather outmoded, quite frankly. He talked about these things being acausal because they couldn't be based on energy, but the argument is using 19th century classical thermodynamics, systems at equilibrium. But if you look at a modern view of energy from a complex adaptive systems model, then these phenomena can be reinterpreted in terms of complexity. And that's what I wanted to talk about now a little bit. So let me take you, and I apologize to the translators for going so far off the page. I'm not using my lecture notes, so I'm very grateful if they can follow. So let's talk a bit about complex adaptive systems. And these are found everywhere in nature. I'll give you some examples. But you have interactions, whether these are people or molecules or subatomic particles or galaxies. These things exist. This can be found everywhere in nature. That when you have interactions in a competitive environment, you can have spontaneous self-organization to form a new holistic structure. It's called an emergent form, that have properties that cannot be reduced to the attributes. The sum is not equal to the parts. It is more than. The whole has something different than you can find in any one part. And there is a feedback. It isn't just simply you form this pattern, but this pattern feeds back and changes what's going on. So it's a nonlinear interactive pattern. A couple of examples. Water. Why is it liquid at room temperature? As a quantum physicist, you look at the structure of water, H2O, a single molecule, you would not predict this to be liquid at room temperature. It should be a gas. But it isn't. Why not? Well, it's because of the interaction between the molecules, not the individual molecule, but it's what goes on in the interaction between that creates a new phenomena that can't be found in the individual. That's emergence. That's a simple example. A couple of other ones, a timely one, hurricanes and typhoons, they're emergent phenomena. And heavens knows, one of the things that may bring us together as a community in the world is global climate change, that we are all going to suffer that no matter what we do. And certainly the heating up of our oceans and the increasing number of these kinds of terrific storms is a very obvious indicator that of increased complexity, which, by the way, means not always good. It is value neutral. It is not positive or negative. But that is one. Here's another one, the pattern forming on shells. That's an example of complex patterns, the way they emerge onto things. These are static in time and in space here once they form. A more temporal example would be the bridge here. This is a group of ants in South America, and they're forming a bridge between two surfaces that exists only long enough for the colony to transmit itself. The bridge is the emergent form. You can't find it in a single ant. However, as a collective, they are able to synthesize. They bring together by working together. This is part of the symbiotic point. They form this kind of function. And these kinds of things are true for the human traffic patterns. Think about that. Stock markets. All of these things can be explored in terms of complexity theory. So in particular, if you apply this to something like synchronicity, you can begin to see that that what seems so magical, the synchronistic experience, is really the emergent form of the dynamic system. It's the emergent pattern that's coming. And one of the things when you study this are what's called self-organizing criticalities. These are extremely important. This is when a system is in transition. For example, when a crystal of ice melts, you go from one state to another. That's a transition state, and you have self-organizing criticality. This is how complexity arises in nature from these kinds of transitions. According to Per Bach, the physicist who first worked on this, complex behavior in nature reflects the tendency of large systems with many components to evolve into a critical state way out of balance, where minor disturbances often lead to what are called avalanches. So what he's doing here, he's just taking a very simple model of adding grains a few at a time onto a pile of sand, or rice grains onto a pile of rice. And what he was interested in are the avalanches that happen, the falls that happen. And you can't predict how big or how small an avalanche you're going to get. There's just no way to do it in the individual event. But in the aggregate, you can actually do quite well. You can really say, if I do this over many, many times, I will have propensity to have this many this many avalanches of this size versus the other size. You know this probably best in terms of what's called the Richter Scale. This is for earthquakes. It's a power law, the same kind of thing, where if you measure the intensity of an event versus the frequency, very few high frequency, but lots and lots of little frequency ones. If you take a log-log plot like this, and you get a straight line, it's what you call a power law. Why is that important? Well, the physics of these situations have been shown that once you have a straight line, that even if you do not understand the underlying phenomena, the same thing is occurring. The same dynamic is at play. So, for example, if you have an 8 on the Richter scale, or if you have a 2 on the Richter scale, if they're on that line, it says the same thing is happening. And of course, we know from geology that we're looking at tectonic plates moving. So that's the explanation. But even if you didn't know, you would say that you would, if you can get this kind of correlation, say that they must be sharing the same phenomena. So what I would argue is that for synchronicities, for these kinds of things, we're also looking at a power law. And I've done some work on this in terms of clinical anecdotes, looking at everything from very mild serendipitous behavior to very outstanding synchronistic experience. And you get this kind of correlation that suggests the same underlying phenomena is operative. Let me give another example of this too. Some colleagues have been working on this, Harold Ottmansbacher and Wolfgang Fock, who you know, have published some work in the Journal of Analytical Psychology extending this kind of discussion. And what they've done is they've looked at these kind of phenomena in terms of what might be a baseline and coincidence above the baseline and dissociation below the baseline, whether it's in the external world or whether it's in the internal world. And they've collected thousands and thousands of examples to try to build up a kind of clinical picture of the range of these experiences to help us. If you frame these things rather than synchronicity, but you frame them instead in terms of emergence, then things like the mind-body relationship are emergent phenomena. That's probably a pretty good fit from neuroscience and from the philosophy of mind. And I would say they form what Ottmansbacher and Fock call the baseline. That's where things are just normally there. You get a kind of an emergent phenomena that's steady and constant. So what we're looking at are things that begin to move above the baseline or below, surprisingly, things where you would expect a correlation and not find it. Well, how about another example or two to help make this a little bit clearer? Clinically, the process of supervision, it often is marked by what's called parallel process. What I mean by that is that a therapist comes to a supervisor who helps with the clinical work, tries to help bring greater understanding. And there's something about what's happening with the patient that gets replicated within the supervisory process. And that sometimes has a kind of synchronistic feel. So here's a case. There was this therapist who was a successful, healthy individual who had gone through his own personal process and was very aware of his own contributions to the therapeutic field. And he brought a case of a traumatized woman who had a dream in which she was enclosed in a space, sort of cave-like space, with only a thick glass window from which to view things. Her therapist was on the other side of this window in another enclosed space and was having difficulty attempting to communicate her. They had to use hand signals. So you get the image that they're kind of rather separated and there's a real barrier between the two. What was particularly striking at just that moment as we entered into exploring the dream, we were working over Skype, which has its own peculiarities. The connection between us suddenly broke down. The visual component remained intact, but the audio component disappeared. We couldn't hear each other. We both rebooted our computers, we reestablished the link, could see each other, but still could not hear one another. So we finally used our telephones and kept the Skype link for the visual component and then used the telephones to do the audio component, and realized as we were doing this that we were encountering something of the psychological dilemma that the therapist was experiencing with his client. Now, we had an alternative solution that wasn't available in the dream. We had our telephones that we could bring out. But it was as if, more importantly, I felt that the traumatic history of the patient was being imposed to help us understand, to develop an empathic understanding of what it's like to be cut off, what it's like not to be able to have a channel of communication like that. And that how do these kinds of experiences, yet again, being trapped in that claustrophobic silence, help sensitize us to the pain of the other. One of the things when these kinds of experiences happen is they are marked by surprise, sometimes even humor. But surprise is the primary affect. And it was as if the patient's unconscious had somehow brought forward an experience that really caused us to reconsider the suffering that was going on, the boundaries that were overly rigid, both for the patient and in the therapist's treatment of the patient. So there's a guidance from the unconscious that comes in here that opens another channel of empathy. I think that there's a possibility there for some more research on therapeutic and supervisory process, the coincidences in them. I won't go through the details, but I believe we could actually study this and open up a much broader field. But what I want to do instead right now is to turn to the second major topic, the symbiotic component of this talk, and find the pathway out of this kind of intra-psychic musing into a more ecological understanding. Very late in life, Jung attempted to describe the psyche from a perspective he hadn't used before very much. He used an ecological metaphor of the rhizome, and I'll quote from him. "Life has always seemed to me like a plant that lives on its rhizome. Its true life is invisible, hidden in the rhizome. The part that appears above ground lasts only a single summer, then it withers away, an ephemeral apparition. When we think of the unending growth and decay of life and civilizations, we cannot escape the impression of absolute nullity. Yet I've never lost a sense of something that lives and endures underneath the eternal flux. What we see is the blossom which passes, the rhizome remains. Now, you know many rhizomatic plants, bamboo, ginseng, aspen trees, ginger, lotus. These are all plants that have a very extensive underground network that then produce at various nodal points out of these sort of energy-rich nodes, flowers of various sorts. But the idea here, the metaphor that's being used from biology, is that there's a deep interconnected layer to the connections between things that is not readily visible, yet holds us in a very deep way. So manifesting something like the problem with the Skype in the middle of just that conversation gives a feeling that there's a rhizomatic connection going on, that there are these tendrils under the surface that link us. These rhizomatic plants have often had a certain kind of folkloric, magical quality to them. And in Europe, the most famous was the mandrake. It was a plant that was imagined, like the ginseng root, it often has a kind of anthropomorphic form. If you look at them, the nodes on them make them actually look humanoid. And in Europe, the imagining was that if it was very desirable, they were used in a lot of medicine, but they were dangerous to pull out of the ground. So what people used to do is to tie a rope around them and attach it to a dog and then move out of the distance and then call the dog over. So the dog would run the risk. Just talk about lack of empathy for the animal, but that's the way you pulled the mandrake root out to get these for various kinds of concoctions. The symbolism suggests that bringing the hidden rhizomatic network system into awareness was overwhelming for consciousness at the time. It brought with it a feeling of the uncanny. And so that's still something I think deep within us that we have to struggle with, is our anxiety about entering into this world of deeper interconnectedness. And I think this brain research actually points in some very interesting ways. The neural plasticity shows that it is possible to get this rhizomatic layer going. This was picked up in philosophy, by the way, by the French philosopher Gilles Deleuze, who borrowed the idea from Jung and went so far as to critique Western thought with this. He said, he and his co-author Philip Guattari commented, "We're tired of trees. We should stop believing in trees, roots, and radicals. They make us suffer too much." In their view, we live in an arborescent culture, from biology to linguistics, from anatomy to theology, and all of philosophy which is founded on tree and root metaphors. Think of diagnostic trees when you do clinical assessment. That's arborescent thinking. In contrast to roots and trees, rhizomes are, this is their term, anti-genealogical, non-hierarchical, a-centered, non-signifying multiplicities that are made up of plateaus, which are connected to other multiplicities. In other words, it's an extensive network that's got a level of equality about it. That's really, it's this non-hierarchical piece that's, that you can't value this over that. That's part of the shift that's happening. Now, obviously, it's a radical statement and probably a bit one-sided. But it does point to a new kind of way of thinking about the structures of the world from a complex point of view. And that leads me to the work of a Canadian botanist, Suzanne Simard, what she and her students have been doing in the Pacific Northwest. I want to tell you two stories about her work with Douglas fir trees that point to a convergence of symbolic and ecological thought. So she was seeking to understand how fir seedlings survive during their growth period to reach the forest canopy. There just is not enough light at the bottom of the forest for the photosynthetic mechanisms to work to allow these trees to make it to the canopy. So she had some ideas, but wanted to test them out. And how she did this is she took an airtight plastic bag and put it around a major tree limb and introduced carbon-14 labeled carbon dioxide into the bag so she could follow the fate of the carbon dioxide. Of course, it gets internalized into the tree and turned into sugars, food for the tree. It's photosynthesis. But what was interesting then was over the next 2 to 3 days, the way in which the sugars that the tree had made were then distributed out through its roots to its seedlings, the seedlings that were genetically linked to the tree. It's very hard not to think of this as a maternal function, that there was somehow the parent tree was caring for, feeding the seedlings. Now, as Peter Wollenberg has pointed out, this isn't purely benevolent. The maternal trees control the growth of the small ones, and they don't let them grow too fast. Often they don't get to their full height until the parents have died. Interesting dynamics about the way the structure of the world is there. But she's gone a step further, and this is where I find the question of symbiosis starts to come in more profoundly. She's done some work on mycorrhizal networks. These are fungal networks these fungi can be extremely large, some of them as much as 50 square miles, just enormous tracts of land that one fungal organism is on, and yet it's interconnecting. Its roots go into the roots with the trees. They're shared, but they're not parasitic. In terms of the symbiotic relationship, it's commensal. That is, that the trees feed the fungi some of their food in terms of the sugars, but the fungi absorb minerals and water much more efficiently than the trees, and they feed the trees. So they're working in partnership. That's fairly interesting, but what becomes for us more interesting is the way they also form a network, an internet of a way, what someone called the Wood Wide Web. What happens is if there's danger, let's say there's an insect infestation, beetles yet again, come and attack the trees. Trees will produce phytohormones. They'll produce warning signals that will go out through the network, and you can watch all the other trees of the network beginning to put their own defenses up. That is, this is a communication network. If one tree starts to die, it downloads its nutrients into the fungal network, which then redistributes them across the entire forest network that's there. And that can include across other species of trees. It's not just simply a one-on-one relationship. So then the final thing I'll mention about these kind of networks is they're finding that these networks are trying to adapt to climate change. That there's very strong evidence that the forest networks themselves are struggling to find ways to adapt to these kind of varying conditions. But there's only so much elasticity. It's only, as far as the organisms can go. So what do we get out of this kind of model where we have a kind of communication system that involves multiple organisms in acting in a coherent and adaptive way? I would say that there's a level of what I would call biological intelligence here that we have yet to truly understand. And so for me, one of the questions about symbiosis and kokoro is the transhuman, to not restrict it to solely a humanistic perspective. That is, we have to understand much more about nature before we can truly enter into the complexity of our world. There are anthropologists now that are writing about how forests think. That is, that there are ways in which these are acting as entities of interconnected life. One more quick example from the animal world, and then I'll go to my last subject, is, and this has to do with the need to rethink symbolism. You know, we've had 100 years of various kinds of psychotherapy and psychoanalysis, and we think we understand human symbolism fairly well, but it rarely takes into account an ecological perspective. So, for example, if you study literature on the figure of the wolf, and you look cross-culturally, it almost always carries some kind of demonic feeling about it. And this is, of course, related to the anxiety of encountering these kind of creatures in their natural habitat. But the truth is, ecologically, alpha predators are extremely important. If you remove a top predator from an area, you usually get degradation of the ecological system it lives in. So there was an inadvertent experiment in the United States about 70, 80 years ago, about 80 years ago now. In Yellowstone Park, they hunted the wolves to extinction, just got rid of them, because the ranchers did not want their livestock being attacked. So for them, it was just a complete good to get rid of the wolf. But the community suffered tremendously for this. And about 70 years after that, they started to reintroduce the wolf back into the ecosystem. And within about 10, 15 years, there was a major rebound, and this was fortunate, that, for example, the wetlands which had gone dry because the beavers had left, what had happened is that the ungulates, the deer and the elk and so forth, began to eat, they'd go lower and lower in elevation and eat up the trees as saplings. And so they stunted the growth of the kind of forest system, which then didn't give the beavers enough wood to create dams and create the wetlands that were necessary for the songbirds and so on. So you have this huge cascade, a tropic cascade. As that's reversed, you're getting recovery. Well, if that's true, and humans are very much a part of nature, then I think we must think about our empathy not only for one another, as important as that is, but our empathy for the ecological systems that we live in, if we are to expect the planet and ourselves to survive. One last piece on symbiosis, and then I'll go to my last topic, and that is, I won't go into detail, the human microbiome. That is, we now know that we are completely covered inside and outside with an enormous array of organisms, mostly microbial and viral. But you have much more DNA that's not human about you than you do human DNA. That's one of the pieces. And in the last 4 or 5 years, there have been more and more psychological aspects of the microbiome, so we're in a symbiotic relationship from the beginning there. So one last step in this discussion, and that is to work on an area called the adjacent possible. When you start to apply complexity to ecological systems, I wanted to go one step further, and that is the notion that has been proposed by a man named Stuart Kaufman. He's a theoretical biologist working at the Santa Fe Institute and one of the founders of complexity theory. And what he's been looking at is a movement in quantum theory itself to say the classical idea is that when you make a measurement, you collapse the wave function. You lose all the possibilities and you make something specific. Is it a wave? Is it a particle? Well, you make a measurement and it becomes one or the other. The contemporary argument is, you know, maybe that's an oversimplification, that what you really should be saying, that all of the possibilities still remain. And so there's a whole realm of, and the reason why this is important is there are some biological systems now that don't collapse quite as rapidly as you would expect. What's called decoherence is slower, and there's an ability to recreate some coherence. So the possibilities must be remaining around. Well, if possibilities remain, then we have another way of looking towards innovation and how new possibilities open up. So let me give you here's just a simple diagram. Here's the realm of the actual, and there's a nearby possibility, an adjacent possibility that can be entered. And when you enter it, lo and behold, a number of other new possibilities come up. This is scientific research, is based on this kind of principle. But in terms of the human psyche, think about dreams. Many people who've been in psychotherapy have the experience of dreaming that the place they live, they've discovered a new room. And they go in that room and something more happens, or there are other doors that open up. That's a direct psychological image of the adjacent possible. And so what happens is this is a way of beginning to move us into using our intuition to capture a more thorough understanding of how we innovate, how we discover the new possibilities, that they are from the rich range of extensive possibilities. So here's a study that was just done last year. This is from an internet database on movies. The green are various kinds of maneuvers that have happened in movies that are innovative. They're the actuals that have already existed. The orange are the adjacent possibles. The open circles, the white, are the far possibles. And these odd little critters here are things that weren't anticipated but show up. And what happens is, as you populate one of these, here it is here, you get a new set of adjacent possibles that come up. And sometimes unexpected items come in that open up yet another dimension to what you're exploring. So in conclusion, as we explore this, my thought is that we're moving into a realm where we can have an intersection between these kind of depth psychological studies and our understanding of the brain. And so here's Kieran Fox and his colleagues published this back in 2013. This is a condensation of a lot of information, but they're looking at the move from goal-directed thought to mind-wandering and spontaneous thought to dream mentation. And they're looking at audio-visual imagery, the bizarreness, the activity in the default mode network, and in the prefrontal cortices, which are more connected with the executive functions. And not surprisingly, as you move towards a kind of less organized, more spontaneous thought, your executive functioning drops some, but the activity in the default mode network increases. And it's in this realm here that an awful lot of creative, spontaneous processing of thought happens. So, and there are lots of examples in the history of science, if you look at that, where someone has worked very hard on a problem. This is part of the creative process. They work very difficult, and then they stop, they take a rest, they go for a walk, they have a dream. And out of that, there's a synthesis that comes up spontaneously from their mind that produces a step into the adjacent possible. Okay, let's leave that and end there. So the idea here is that we enter into these kinds of possibilities in ways that are unexpected and can bring us to new complex organizations. So with that, I think that's where the symbiosis in the future lies. Thank you.